Good morning, everyone. Happy Sunday to you all. We are here with Reverend Dennis Reynolds, and we are discussing his sermon, Different Voices, Different, oh dear, Different Voices, Different Stories. So welcome, Reverend Dennis.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just open to hear what you folks, have to say and what may have, moved, in you, listening to what I was sharing from voices other than my own.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think JC wanted to go first, and I've just asked you to unmute. So. Oh dear. Let's see. Oh, did we lose her? No.
Unmute. There we go.
There we are.
Okay. I love it when a person gets into the topic with a story, because that allows me to feel like I understand better than you start with the point. And so I love the idea that we got stories from the lives of these people. And then I loved your kind of not really offhand comment, but you were speaking of reading, I think, one of Murray's books, and your comment was, and as a man, I found it difficult at places to read. And I just wanted to hug you. It was so nice to hear that. And I wish there were more opportunities I think we as women need to help men feel that by supporting them in telling our stories and in reading. So anyway, I remember your comment as being right from your heart, and that's what I would look to do if I were with a man hearing a woman's side of things for the first time or something like that. So anyway, thank you for that. It works with me.
Well, Polly Murray's poetry, both as, outspoken, well, and again, that word woman, as I mentioned in the sermon, she,
right.
Had some questions about those gender binaries in terms of her own lived experience, but also as a Black woman, reminded me of why it's necessary sometimes to move into uncomfortable places and spaces. And what she says is appropriate critiques of patriarchy and racism are things that I could have just turned the page and looked for the one that was more about hope. And the couple of poems of hers I shared are the ones that are less uncomfortable. But I invite people, there's an online presence called the Polly Murray Project, which has more biographical information and also access to some more of her writing. That's one of the things I shared with some friends this week about. She is such an underappreciated, underknown, figure in the history of the 20th century. Who, her success, she described it as I survived as a Black woman. So yeah, we need to read and listen to things that are sometimes a little bit uncomfortable.
Well, I'm really curious about that, though, because if I'm not mistaken, the patriarchy hypothesis, right, is something that you agree with, right?
What do you mean by agreement? And
you agree that it exists. You agree that it has valid explanatory power for the structure of American culture, or?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have a sense of historically of much of Western culture, and that's right. Some of the critique. that people have of what's been labeled as a white supremacist culture
Right.
is a sense that it draws from a particular historical philosophy
Right.
that I
So,
think can be traced back to Plato.
right. Why would that be if it's something that you agree with, right? Why would that be uncomfortable for you? Could you
Well,
explain that?
no, I mean, I agree that it exists,
Right.
and I have certainly been a beneficiary of it, but I don't think it's the best humanity can be. I don't think it's our best self.
But
Um,
wouldn't it be encouraging to you if somebody's bringing that out?
what
Like,
do you
well,
mean?
I guess
Well,
I'm curious as
well,
to why it's uncomfortable.
right. Well, a criticism of the patriarchy or a criticism of the behavior of white people can be uncomfortable as a white man.
Okay.
And to say, that a culture has limited my opportunities because it's advantaged someone like me makes me a little uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And that's the uncomfort I feel like I need to continue to try to sit with. I mean, I talked to Martha when I was talking to her about the topic that I wanted to, in this particular sermon, lift up in this service with the music and the sources of the readings from Langston Hughes et al., to lift up voices other than a bunch of dead white guys. I mean, when I went to seminary, in our main gathering hall, there were portraits of noted ministers in Unitarian and Universalist history, and they were all dead white guys. And some of my, women, fellow classmates said, "Could we get some different images in here?" And that's been the reality of our movement as well.
Hmm.
Who were the leaders, who was allowed to speak. Maybe I'll do a rework for you folks at some point in the future about, I'm doing a name blank here, but Ralph Waldo Emerson's Aunt Mary Moody Emerson, who one of my professors said that a lot of what he wrote in Nature seems to have been drawn directly from her journals.
Hmm.
But as a woman in the 1850s, she didn't have an opportunity to be published, and Ralph Waldo did.
Okay. Cool.
So there's some of those kinds of things that are part of our history as well. Who got put aside? I mean, we didn't talk about Pauli Murray,
Mm-hmm.
so.
Okay. Well, you did.
I did,
which
I
is,
know.
yeah, which is good.
And it was a woman of color ministerial colleague of mine who shared some Pauli Murray poetry that I read and went, I think it was the Hope piece that we closed with, and I went,
Mm-hmm.
who is or was this poet?
Mm-hmm.
And because I followed up and Googled to find out who that voice was, I found out that voice was an amazing personage that I had never previously heard of. And I went, I'm going to look for opportunities to tell some other people about Pauli Murray.
Great. Laleen wanted to go next.
I did indeed. Thank you so much for another incredibly stimulating service. Michael kind of took the beginning of my question, but I'm sure the depth with which you will take it will be really enlightening. I've been working on putting together a series dealing with white privilege and looking at it from a small town like ours here in Roseburg, where so many people, have spent most of their lives not really ever knowing people of color. And the challenge, or part of the challenge I'm running into, is that it's difficult to think about dealing with white privilege without dealing with male privilege, because we live in a community that's still so dominated by, essentially men in powers of government and in other kinds of positions. So I guess I'm looking for, again, some sort of recommendations, suggestions on how I can deal with both white privilege and male privilege under the Black Lives Matter, how did we get here whole premise.
Mhm. Well, I think, that how do we get here is an important piece. I think it was maybe Stokely Carmichael who said in the 60s, how are you going to know where you're at if you don't know where you're coming from? And I think a unique position for me, and I'm a lifelong Oregonian. I was born in the Willamette Valley and have lived in this state most of my life. And I didn't know until my daughter was in high school and wrote her senior thesis at the International High School in Eugene on racial discriminatory laws and Black exclusion laws in Oregon's history. So I think an important part for many of us in Oregon is to understand the reality of our history, of a territory that did not allow Black people to be here. It was illegal to be Black within the Oregon Territory, and we didn't take some of the racial discriminatory language out of our Oregon Constitution till like 2002. So to understand why we don't have contact with very many people of color, for me, it was a helpful step. And to understand what that meant. And then a century ago in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was a powerful voice in the Oregon legislature. So it was not a safe place for people of color to be, both legally and, what happened to people of color here for much of our history. And so that's why there aren't very many people here of color. And just even looking at neighborhoods in Eugene, I grew up in a neighborhood in Salem where non-white people were not allowed to buy property there. There was a clause in the deed, the property my parents built a house on when I was a baby. And I was in like the third grade where the first Asian could arrive. So I think it's an important part of seeing that history, but also that deeper before a century ago history, there wasn't a women's suffrage. And there was this frontier spirit that we still hang on to here. I grew up and for my 14th birthday, I got a 20 gauge pump shotgun. And that's being a man in Oregon, the capacity to go out and kill food, So there's a whole cultural piece. I gotta say though that my younger sister also went deer hunting too, just to prove she could. So there was part of a shift that began a half a century ago, but we've really only been deconstructing some of that for a half a century, which in the scope of human history is a relatively short period of time. So those are thoughts that come to mind. And I think that's part of what's coming out of the larger UUA is the white supremacist culture also has woven into that fabric a patriarchal culture. As Plato, we didn't read, whatever women in Greek culture were writing or thinking. We read Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, Plato saying what Socrates had to say. So its foundations in Western thought, as opposed to, some of the more matriarchal influences in Iroquois culture and some indigenous cultures as well. That helpful?
It's great. Glennis wanted to talk.
Well, I have only a couple of points. I spent all but 16 years of my 66 in this town. And we did have sundowner laws here.
Mm-hmm.
We had one family when I was in school who was African American, and the elder child was a girl who scandalized the whole town when she dated a boy for prom who was white, and I can remember the elderly women in my church when a mixed marriage occurred of one of the town's most popular family's daughters, a beautiful China doll person, and they were just horrified and they can't be happy. And I remember thinking, Well, not with you old biddies that are, that are just,
Mhm.
but it is something that I'm aware of still being here, a great deal of it, and it's really sad. And you can see this in the stout embracing of the Confederate flag, for one thing. And so that's one thing I wanted to speak to. Another was that I had heard of Pauli Murray in studies, in sociology studies,
Good.
when we were talking about, but I don't remember going in depth enough. And you have inspired me now to check her out a lot more, because remarkable is an understatement for this woman. And between her, Joseph, you mentioned Joseph Lowery, John Lewis, that took incredible courage on their parts, and everything that they have done. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to mention too was that as a musician, the music that you have chosen for this service was enough to bring me to tears. It was um, very, very powerful to me. And I've always liked the circle round one too, so that had the same effect. So thank you for another wonderful sermon. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, Glenn Thomas Rideout, who I suggested the recorded piece of his with that more historic spiritual, I guess we call it. And I love the way he weaves his voice becomes voices.
Yes.
So he, pre-records aspects and then harmonizes with himself. I first encountered him at a regional assembly where he came and did choir, and I got to sing with him.
Oh.
And so he's one of those voices that inspires me. And so I would certainly include him in the list of voices that I invited you folks to hear this morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you introduced him to me as well, and I've very much enjoyed many of his recordings. Julianne and Glennis both. Julianne in the text wrote, "I recall sundown signs in Cottage Grove and Grants Pass when I was in high school." For anybody who doesn't know what this is, could you because Glennis also mentioned it, could you explain it?
Want me to? Or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that'd be great.
If you are here after sundown and you are African American, you are not welcome. You need to be gone.
Okay, great. And that was
if you weren't, you were violently kicked out.
okay.
Yes.
But it was something that was written into the law for Black people.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
There were signs. There were actual signs up on the outskirts of town by the border.
Great. Yeah, I mean, great for explaining it.
The local legend, and it really isn't a legend, the civic, in quotes, civic group, the Grants Pass Caveman, were basically all KKK, and it was not a secret.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you for clearing that up. And I believe Connie had a statement or question.
Oh, I'm sitting here waiting. I would just like to say to all of you and to Dennis, today was a good example of why I go to the Unitarian Church. Listening to your sermon, Dennis, just made me want to be a better person. And that's what's important to me when I join a community, that's the way I feel. I also think someone needed to tell us before the service began, this is a 2-tissue or 3-tissue sermon. I too, at that song at the end, wow, it was really a good service.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Okay, great. So I'll play the professor and call on people now. Joe, do you feel like adding anything to the discussion?
Well, I didn't know much at all either about Pauli Murray, but I was just looking her up, And I saw a photo of her. And I think that one of the reasons why she might have been so successful in areas that she uh, was successful in is the fact that she didn't look like your typical African American. I mean, she really was very attractive in the as far as attractiveness in the eyes of a white person um, in those days. She was a very attractive woman, and probably that opened some doors for her. But I also was very moved by the way that you honored John Lewis. He was quite a fellow.
Well, the Pauline Murray piece, there's some interesting stuff when you dig a little further about when she applied to the University of North Carolina and was denied because of her race. She put forward some information about many of her ancestors being the white part of her genetic upbringing had in fact attended the University of North Carolina and had been, upstanding citizens, but they were the ones who had raped her grandparents, and part of that reality. There's a moving piece that was published in the New York Times. I could paraphrase the title by a Black woman who clearly is multiracial when you see her, saying, "My body is a Confederate memorial." That the fact that she is multiracial was because of the power of white men who owned and took the bodies of her, great or great grandmothers as their prerogative. So that's part of the reality of multiracial America, comes from that part of plantation culture, which is unfortunately true. I mean, we know more now than we did for a long time about Sally Hemings, who, was, Thomas Jefferson's partner from the time she was 14 years old, and that reality. Hers is an interesting one because she traveled to France with Jefferson, and she was a free woman in France, but she chose not to stay there for who knows what complex reasons, but came back to Virginia, where she once again became a slave, his slave, as well as his, some kind of life partner, however that was labeled. So
There's
and descendants have been recognized by the Thomas Jefferson descendants larger group that used to be the only ones who were included were the white descendants of Thomas Jefferson, but Sally Hemings' ancestors are now also recognized as being descendants of Thomas Jefferson.
There's a movie, Jefferson in Paris, which I think is Nick Nolte plays Thomas Jefferson, but you get to see a little bit. They have an actress to play Sally Hemings, and you get to see a little bit of the interaction. Of course, it's in no way historically accurate, I'm sure, but it's an interesting exploration of that relationship and her relationship with the family.
Right, and she was a gift to the Jeffersons and his wife, I believe, a wedding gift from a cousin, and she was multiracial. So she appeared more attractive, and often the multiracial slaves were the house slaves because they didn't look as stereotypically Black. And so they fit a particular definition of what was deemed attractive.
So one thing, I don't always mean to be devil's advocate in these discussions, but one thing that I would be curious about, just as a general thought, is when do we know we've arrived? At what point is critical race theory falsifiable?
Expand on the question a little bit, if you could.
Well, so I mean, okay, so I've made it no secret that I have deep critiques about critical race theory. I don't believe that critical race theory, so for instance, I don't believe that we are a white supremacist nation. I don't believe in white privilege. I don't believe in male privilege. I don't believe that these things have the theoretical explanatory power to describe why America functions the way that it is. It's not to say that racism doesn't exist. It's just that in the hierarchy of things that affect Black people, right? We can talk about any other group as well. But what is more dangerous to a Black person, white racism or high sodium content in fast food, right? High sodium content in fast food kills more Black people a year than really anything else, right? And so my question to the people who believe in these hypotheses is, how do we know, at what point do we know we've fixed the problem?
My short answer would be, it's a continuing process, and there isn't a point of fix. That there's a solution point where humanity is evolved to the point where we no longer classify people who look or have attributes that is different as other. So I don't know that that point will exist. I think it's a kind of continual unfolding. I remember when I worked for the university, and cultural competency became part of a criteria for professional assessment. And cultural competency was progress and never defined as a place where one would become fully culturally competent. And then the other part, in terms of, Michael, you bring up the questions, and like I said, I now live these days with a woman with a PhD in anthropology and global health. What are the cultural constructs that create a situation where Black people eat higher sodium diets? What part of that is food deserts in many Black communities?
Right.
What part of that is who has access to healthy food financially and otherwise? So it's certainly multifactored. I mean, like I said, she looks at the cultural implications upon health. Culture and access to resources shapes health. I have the financial resources to have a CSA membership so that I get my deliveries regularly of good, clean, organic food. And I buy, pasture-raised beef because I have the economic capacity to make those choices. And it's readily available in my community in Eugene. And if I lived in, inner city Philadelphia, then what was available at the store might be chips and soda.
Right. Of course, if you take the single fatherhood or single motherhood aspect out of the equation, a lot of the financial, restraints, right, are alleviated. So I chose high sodium as just one example
Right.
of things. Yeah. But I don't want to monopolize the time. Lillian wanted to say something.
Well, my first reaction, Michael, was if I didn't know the depth to which you like to play devil's advocate, I think I might say that you're probably the best example I could imagine of male, white supremacist privilege thinking. And I would be saying that from the perspective of a white lesbian woman who grew up in housing projects, really poor, and has a multiracial family with 4 African-American Mexican grandchildren who have been coming to Roseburg I guess since about 2004, almost every summer, and one of whom lived here and tried to go to UCC.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we could say it almost doesn't matter which minority group one belongs to. There is such a hierarchy of pecking order that it's hard, I guess, Reverend, for me to even imagine, certainly not in my lifetime, but even in the lifetime of my grandchildren, I can't imagine a non-bigoted, prejudicial society. I mean, I just think back to the early 70s, I mentioned before, when I created a course at one of the state universities called Character and Conflict, which was all about the isms. The schism seems so great, the polarization seems so strong that folks in the middle, kind of do this. And I can't even imagine 50 years from now, I guess, would be an accurate thing. I do hope my grandchildren, before they're my age, though, do find a much more fair world to live in.
And I think that much more. I mean, that last piece, the closing, and Lewis's op-ed that he had published in the Times was, going forward, and inviting us to continue the work, recognizing how much it's ongoing work. I sometimes say that I'm glad that I get to embrace a theology that says that just maybe I'll get more than one life to work through my stuff, the possibility. I'm a Unitarian Universalist. I'm open to a lot of possibilities. But I also reiterate that part of I am a Unitarian Universalist, which is part of what I appreciate about Lewis's language, and much of what Dr. King spoke of is very universalist in nature. That it's not about hellfire and damnation, and you do, what is this narrow pathway in order to get salvation in the afterlife. It's you do good work because you're called to do good work. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's part of, an important part of our faith tradition is both our Unitarian, some people describe it as our Unitarian head and our Universalist heart. That, try to bring together the two of those to combine to be more fully present as people who choose to do that as a spiritual path that also brings something that some people call soul into being. I remind myself periodically that the word psyche, the foundations for psychology or psychiatry, means soul. That mind versus soul dichotomy that we sometimes label was not what they were talking about, 4,000 years ago when we first began to use the language. So.
Only because I was mentioned by name at the beginning of Lalene's statement. I just didn't want it to go unaddressed. Is that I don't believe that my identity as a white male prevents me from observing situations and coming to conclusions based on rational thought. So it's important for me anyway that identity is something that is secondary to someone's ideas, right? The idea is what's important. Identity comes afterwards for me. So, but Connie wanted to say something.
Well, I wanted to refer to the beginning of the service where Dennis read the quote by John Lewis, you are a light, you are the light, but the part of it that I would like to have him speak to maybe in another sermon is the part that says, release the need to hate. I think that would be an entire service, and I think it would make an incredible discussion.
Yeah, that's a powerful piece. And I think that's some of that sense of othering. Who are those we consider to be other, rather than part of, even a human community, or beyond that, a community of all life. I'll give that some ponders in terms of kind of where to go to articulate that. I mean,
Mhm.
and I'll share with you folks, this is part of my practice, is to explore articulations of what's moving for me. And how do I take steps to those directions? And part of it is the inspiration from people who I think have taken some steps in those directions, haven't achieved some ideal reality. I mean, we've got some historical evidence that the Reverend Dr. King may not have been true to the vows of his marriage.
Oh, yes.
We have some evidence that suggests he may have taken major passages that became his doctoral dissertation from somebody's work. So he was not a flawless being, but he certainly did some good work. And that's inspirational for all of us, recognizing we are all fully human. And how do we move forward to release? And release isn't like this. Release is sort of loosening our grip on a kind of continual unfolding basis. Yeah. Change is that. Change isn't where, some dichotomous place one day and someplace totally different the next day, or even at the end of a 10-day retreat. It's an unfolding process that maybe we get lifetimes to participate in.
Great. We've been joined by Lois. Lois, do you feel like making a comment or asking a question regarding the service?
Good morning, everyone. No, Bob was here with me. He's been trying to get it on his computer. I don't know if you have him on the mailing list for the link. Tried to forward it, but it didn't go blue.
Oh, dear.
Yes, I really appreciated this sermon, and I love thinking sermons.
Oh, dear. We lost your audio. There we go.
Yeah.
Lois, could you repeat what you just said? You dropped out a little bit.
I like sermons that make me remember them for days, that I can think back on and give an inspiration from that. I agree with what Reverend Reynolds has said, that it's hard to generate spirit when there's no audience there to listen and respond to the various sentences and the thoughts that come about. Although I thought the whole service was well, and I really like the continuity that you have created in putting the service on. So it's much, much better every week. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, big thank you.
Right, and Michael's, just so people, the part you can't see is Michael standing there going, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Yeah. And I, not supposed to see. Yeah.
I told them about the
That's all right. That's all right.
making the invisible visible.
Right. We haven't heard from Martha yet. Do you feel like? Oh, wait, you got to unmute. Maybe Martha's having some trouble. Let's.
Got it.
Oh, there we go.
I'm listening to all of this, and the piece that still continues to strike me living here, coming from another place. When I found out the details of Oregon's history and how this society is sort of insular, that's my opinion.
Oh, yes.
Many people have been here for generations, and their thought processes are in a somewhat of a box, whether that's good or bad or otherwise. It's their support system. And that's been hard for me as a person to hear the small thinking. And I agree with everything that people have said. It is a continuum. And the more we get exposed to bits and pieces, I had the experience of listening to a fellow at AUW who showed us a map of Roseburg that he had found in the archives that did show these are the places that you cannot sell these lots to families of, they didn't say color, they said Negroes. Of course, I grew up in Chicago, but I also had a family who had slaves. My grandmother's, my paternal grandmother's family in Miller County, Missouri, had a slave who, when she was freed, did not want to leave the family and spent her whole life sleeping by the hearth because that's where she wanted to be. And she's the only Black person in the family plot within this entire cemetery in Miller County, Missouri. So there's this love and family aspect and the personal issues that go much deeper than labels. And it's been hard for me to adjust, and I try really hard to take in and try to, when I have a chance to talk to somebody, sort of feel them out and see where the parameters are and see if I can move the barriers out a little bit. But it's difficult. At least for me, it has been difficult. So that's all I want to say.
Well, we all, kind of operate and create our own structures of meaning and understanding based first and foremost on our lived experience. But I believe we can broaden that experience by intentionally exposing ourselves to other voices. Like I have a practice periods of time that I'll read a poet's work early in the morning, a poem or two from particular poets. And I've made a point of, trying to read more Langston Hughes, more other poets of color of, boy, why am I blanking on the former woman poet laureate's name?
Maya Angelou or
Maya Angelou,
yeah.
to read and to begin to look at other perspectives other than those that arise from my lived experience. And like I said, somebody quoted a Pauli Murray poem, and I said, I want to read some more of that poet's work and about that poet. So sometimes when we're in places where our day-to-day reality, and mine certainly is, Eugene is 5% Black, which is maybe a couple percentage points different than Roseburg, but even with all of our claims to be so progressive, there's probably more people of color in Springfield where it's more difficult to be a person of color because real estate is cheaper and all that history of economic realities that come into play. So that's where I go when it's not part of my lived experience, to try to seek opportunities to look at the lived experience of others, particularly poets. I don't know if I've shared with this community, but one of my mentor ministers, Bruce Bodie, who was the minister in Port Townsend when I did my internship there, his description is the poets are the prophets of our time. As they were when you read, of so-called prophets from the past, they were poets. Much of Christian literature, particularly Old Testament, like the Psalms and the Songs of Solomon, are poetry written by poets who had a particular lived experience in a particular time. Langston Hughes stuff still resonates as very timely now, and was written, more than half a century ago. Fundamental truths. And he critiques, brings up some of the systemic critiques that are being lifted up now.
Yeah, the Sri Guru Granth Sahib, the holy book of the Sikh religion, is their hymnal. Their hymnal is their holy book, and the poetry in that is rather beautiful as well. I've asked JC to unmute because she had a hand up. Oh, and Laleen, is that a hand up as well? Okay. JC, you're still muted. There we go.
My comment relates, Reverend, to when you said, that's a good point, I'm not sure where it leads, or what you would pull into a sermon about the hate thing. And I've had a lot of opportunity, we all have, in listening to the news to figure out how to have compassion for how to change the hate, because I don't usually go there, into some compassion, and then tone it down to actually a person you might meet in Roseburg, living in Roseburg. And my suggestion is, for myself, where do I find compassion if I'm trying to influence a person's beliefs about racism, about racial difference, and that the differences are important? Because these people have grown up. This is a belief system. It's not just a happenstance. So I'm asking them to consider something that will cause a big change, it would seem to them. And that, I think, is the process that I am learning to embrace about myself. The Kubler-Ross stuff on death also works for changing your life, because you're changing, or you're letting die, something that you thought was real and that you believed in. So this is not a simple thing. It's a big challenge to get somebody to make a change that isn't involved with hate. To learn how to do that and know that you're still yourself is a challenge that I think you thinking requires.
No, so this is one of the opportunities where the preacher just gets to say, "Amen, sister."
Wise words. Julianne wrote in the chat, Gwendolyn Brooks, Nikki Giovanni, and Audre Lorde are suggested Black poets for anybody who wants to check those out.
Yeah, Gwendolyn Brooks is new to me, but I do know Nikki Giovanni and Audre Lorde's work.
Cool. I think Laleen wanted to say something, but we lost her. Hopefully she'll come back soon. Kim, we haven't heard from you. Do you feel like saying anything?
Yeah, I hear a lot about, hatred and racism and with Black people. What I'm not hearing is solutions to the problem. And we're fighting, we're burning down buildings, we're doing this, but no one's coming up with solutions. And we have to realize that a lot of problems come from the way that people are living. And if they're not having like a good job and a way to support themselves, then they're going to end up hating towards other people because they don't have a way of making their own living. And I think that's comes a lot about it. We should help them provide for themselves. And that goes for anybody, not just Black people. And I see that a lot with Head Start. I see a lot of kids, and a lot of them probably don't have a lot of food and they're hungry. I mean, I have kids who want more and more, and we give it to them. And I see kids who their environment is so bad that they act out when they're in school violently. And I just would like to see those type of solutions and not just arguing about how racist we all are. We need to come up with solutions to prevent racism in the world.
Well, and I think you're right. I'm a developmentalist, as you know, Martha reminds you folks in my intro. For 30 years, I worked in early childhood education before ministry, and I look towards constructivist theory, that we construct notions based on our lived experience from childhood. And if your life is struggle, then you define life as struggle. If your life is, joyous, then you define life as joyous. And sometimes it's a deconstruction process that comes before you can construct a different kind of alternative. And I mean, part of my own work is I have reestablished a daily meditation practice, and I sit with my wife, and she recites a version of the Buddhist metta prayer from memory. I'm just learning to memorize it myself, and may all beings be happy and at their ease. It includes phrases, may none despise another, in any state. What I appreciate about Buddhism is recognition that's a practice. And I've been saying that over and over again for weeks so far, and it will be months and it will be years before it becomes fully embedded, if it does, as part of my worldview. I have my own reactions to people who look dramatically different for whatever reasons because of my lived experience. But you're right. One of the ones that I'm reminded of is the song from South Pacific. You have to be taught, you have to be carefully taught to hate all the people that your parents do. And programs like Head Start and good early intervention programs are the places to begin deconstructing that. And that's a foundational piece. So that's something I carried forward in my first career that has not gone away. My daughter just got delivery yesterday, as an example, 2 books. They're hard, those board books for my now 4-month-old grandson. And one of them is called The Anti-Racist Baby Book, which she had found in another recommendation. And then she also just bought him a book and said, this is for you too, Grandpa. A is for activists.
That's
so it's like we're working on carefully teaching this little baby in a different kind of way. And when he returns to South Africa, they're going to engage while they're working, and Grandma and Grandpa aren't around anymore to assist in childcare, a Xhosa nanny. So this little boy will grow up loved by a Black person who's part of his regular life, and hopefully become bilingual in English and Xhosa. And when he hangs out with his dad family, he might also pick up some Afrikaans. So, what happens for young kids is very vital in how we deconstruct and create opportunities for constructing different, more positive worldviews. So Head Start work, thank you for doing that foundational work.
The song "You Have to Be Carefully Taught," there was a lot of pressure on Rodgers and Hammerstein to take that song out of the musical, and they just outright refused. They said, if you take that song out, you're taking out the entire punchline of the show. So we are winding down, but Connie had something to say. And you are unmuted, Connie.
I just wanted to make a little comment about Martha talking about moving to Roseburg. I came to Roseburg in '73, and I still had a job at the University of Oregon, so every Friday I would go back to Eugene. But I remember talking so much about this community in a negative way, and these people are so conservative and blah, blah, blah. But what I think I finally came to is that by doing that, I was separating myself from the part of me that was like this community. And I think we have to remember that is a lot of times these things that we're, and this has to do with that line, I think about loosening our grip on hate. I think one of the ways is stop focusing on the differences of our politics or whatever, and more about what we have in common. That's mine.
And it's, that fundamental first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, even that person who we so strongly disagree with. And that's, a reflection of, that particular principle comes so strongly from our Universalist tradition. A tradition that tries to deconstruct a sense of othering and judgment. But yeah, that's the hardest part of the practice sometimes, the inherent worth and dignity of very difficult people. And I could use stronger words too, but still, I think you get the point. To recognize the inherent worth and dignity of whoever is across the room from you, whoever is on the other side of that conversation, the other side of the fence with your next door neighbor. I've got a neighbor who calls me the enemy because he didn't like the fact that a house was built in what used to be vacant property next to his land, and that's not going to change for him. That's the fact that I'm here angers him.
So we're venturing on 12:30, but maybe we could do some rapid fire. Julianne, you've written into the chat. Do you feel like voicing any of those things briefly?
I grew up in Myrtle Creek and left for many, many years, lived with older brothers and sisters who lived literally around the world. And now I'm back in Myrtle Creek and I see the same families who never got out of town, raising grandchildren now with the same viewpoints. And it's discouraging. I think, seriously, old attitudes simply sometimes have to die, literally, to change. And I think now with the recent Black Lives Matter movement, we're seeing the biggest turnaround in public sentiment that I have ever seen in terms of race. And it's due in large part to young people that are driving it. And so I have a great appreciation for the bravery. And if they can drag along some of the older folks, good. And if they can make institutional changes as a result, even better. But that's going to be a very, very difficult task that we all have to participate in. And it's a natural inclination for humans to view others as the other, and it has to be unlearned. And there are very few societies that have ever not seen someone else as the other.
Mhm. Okay. Did you have a response for that, Dennis, or?
Well, in terms of those societies, I look at those places where I think we've done better. And if you look at Spain prior to the Edict of 1492 that Ferdinand and Isabella did, as they were sending Columbus off to this part of the planet, they all were also excluding Jews and Muslims from Spain. And prior to that, there was a greater acceptance that did exist for a time on the Iberian Peninsula by all historic accounts. And so I look to those, if you will, shining lights that, give me some evidence and faith that we can do better. We can be better, without attempting to pretend like we're colorblind or deny differences that come from our lived experience, but be more open-hearted and accepting. And I think, good, true interfaith work is a place where some of that can happen.
Great. Well, we in the last 15 minutes, we've been joined by Bob. Bob, do you feel like, okay, all right, you don't have to. Well, Reverend Dennis, gosh, I can't thank you enough. I don't know how everybody else feels, but I have absolutely loved this conversation. And yeah, I really appreciate these Sunday chats. Could you give us maybe a closing thought?
Boy, I guess, my first thought that comes to mind is I equally appreciate it that, as a developmentalist, I learned a lot about how neural pathways are constructed through a process of myelinization in the human mind. And we are getting more and more research that we can keep those pathways flexible by continuing to do conversations like this. And that's ongoing work, and I appreciate this part of participating with you folks, not just being some kind of voice on high. even if when I'm just being the reader, or Martha is sharing with me being the reader, hearing many voices.
Great.
Thank you for that.
Well, yours is a particularly special voice. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a beautiful Sunday, and we'll see you next time.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.